Welcome back in part 3 of BBC. Television broadcasting was suspended from 1 September 1939 to 7 June 1946 during the Second World War, and it was left to BBC radio broadcasters such as Reginald Ford to keep the nation's spirits up.
The BBC moved most of its radio operations out of London, initially to Bristol and then to Bedford.
Concerts were broadcast from the Bedford Corn Exchange, the Trinity Chapel in St. Paul's Church. Bedford was the studio for the daily service from 1941 to 1945, and in the darkest days of the war, in 1941, the Archbishops of Canterbury and York came to St. Paul's to broadcast to the UK and the world on the National Day of Prayer.
BBC employees during the war included George Orwell, who spent 2 years with a broadcaster.
During his role as Prime Minister during the war, Winston Churchill delivered 33 major wartime speeches by radio, all of which were carried by the BBC within the UK.
On 18 June 1940, French General Charles de Gaulle, in exile in London as the leader of the Free French, made a speech, broadcast by the BBC, urging the French people not to capitulate to the Nazis.
Whoa!
In October 1940, Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret made their first radio broadcast for the BBC's Children's Hour, addressing other children who had been evacuated from cities. In 1938, John Reith and the British government, specifically the Ministry of Information which had been set up for WW2, designed the censorship apparatus for the inevitability of war.
Due to the BBC's advancements in shortwave radio technology, the corporation could broadcast across the world during the Second World War.
Within Europe, the BBC European service would gather intelligence and information regarding the current events of the war in English.
Regional BBC workers, based on their regional geopolitical climate, would then further censor the material their broadcasts would cover.
Nothing was to be added outside the preordained news items.
For example, the BBC Polish service was heavily censored due to fears of geopartisan relations with the Soviet Union.
Controversial topics, that is, the contested Polish and Soviet border, the deportation of Polish citizens, the arrests of Polish Home Army members, and the Katyn massacre were not included in Polish broadcasts.
American radio broadcasts were broadcast across Europe on BBC channels.
This material also passed through the BBC's censorship office, which surveilled and edited American coverage of British affairs.
By 1940, across all BBC broadcasts, music by composers from enemy nations was censored.
In total, 99 German, 38 Austrian, and 38 Italian composers were censored.
The BBC argued that, like the Italian or German languages, listeners would be irritated by the inclusion of enemy composers.
Any potential broadcasters said to have pacifist, communist, or fascist ideologies were not allowed on the BBC's airwaves.
In 1937, the MI5 security officer was given a permanent office within the organization.
This officer would examine the files of potential political subversives and mark the files of those deemed a security risk to the organization, blacklisting them.
This was often done on spurious grounds. Even so, the practice would continue and expand during the years of the Cold War.
There was a widely reported urban myth that, upon resumption of the BBC television service after the war, announcer Leslie Mitchell started by saying, "As I was saying before we were so rudely interrupted."
In fact, the first person to appear when transmission resumed was Jasmine Bly, and the words said were, "Good afternoon, everybody. How are you? Do you remember me, Jasmine Bly?"
The European Broadcasting Union was formed on 12 February 1950 in Portray with the BBC among the 23 founding broadcasting organizations. Competition to the BBC was introduced in 1955 with a commercial and independently operated television network of ITV.
However, the BBC monopoly on radio services would persist until 8 October 1973, when, under the control of the newly renamed Independent Broadcasting Authority, IBA, the UK's first independent local radio station, LBC, came on air in the London area.
As a result of the Pilkington Committee report of 1962, in which the BBC was praised for the quality and range of its output, and ITV was very heavily criticized for not providing enough quality programming, the decision was taken to award the BBC a second television channel, BBC Two, in 1964, renaming the existing service BBC One.
BBC Two used the higher resolution 625-line standard, which had been standardized across Europe.
BBC Two was broadcast in color from 1 July 1967 and was joined by BBC One and ITV on 15 November 1969.
The 405-line VHF transmissions of BBC One and ITV were continued for compatibility with older television receivers until 1985.
Starting in 1964, a series of pirate radio stations, starting with Radio Caroline, came on the air and forced the British government finally to regulate radio services to permit nationally based advertising-financed services.
In response, the BBC reorganized and renamed their radio channels.
On 30 September 1967, the Light program was split into Radio 1, offering continuous, popular music, and Radio 2 more easy listening.
The third program became Radio 3, offering classical music and cultural programming.
The home service became Radio 4, offering news and non-musical content such as quiz shows, readings, dramas, and plays.
Whoa!
As well as the 4 national channels, a series of local BBC radio stations were established in 1967, including Radio London.
In 1969, the BBC Enterprises Department was formed to exploit BBC brands and programs for commercial spin-off products.
In 1979, it became a wholly owned limited company, BBC Enterprises Limited.
In 1974, the BBC's teletext service, CFAX, was introduced, created initially to provide subtitling, but developed into a news and information service.
In 1978, BBC staff went on strike just before the Christmas, thus blocking out the transmission of both channels and amalgamating all 4 radio stations into one.
Since the deregulation of the UK television and radio market in the 1980s, the BBC has faced increased competition from the commercial sector and from the advertiser-funded public service broadcaster Channel 4, especially on satellite television, cable television, and digital television services.
In the late 1980s, the BBC began a process of divestment by spinning off and selling parts of its organization.
In 1988, it sold off the Halton Press Library, a photographic archive, which had been acquired from the Picture Post magazine by the BBC in 1957.
The archive was sold to Brian Dukes and is now owned by Getty Images.
In 1987, the BBC decided to centralize its operations by the management team with radio and television divisions joining forces together for the first time. The activities of the news and currents departments and coordinated jointly under the new directorate.
During the 1990s, this process continued with a separation of certain operational arms of the corporation into autonomous but wholly owned subsidiaries, with the aim of generating additional revenue for program making.
BBC Enterprises was reorganized and relaunched in 1995 as BBC Worldwide Limited.
In 1998, BBC Studios, outside broadcasts, post-production, design, costumes and wigs were spun off into BBC Resources Limited.
The BBC Research Department has played a major part in the development of broadcasting and recording techniques.
The BBC was also responsible for the development of the NICAM stereo standard.
In recent decades, a number of additional channels and radio stations have been launched. Radio 5 was launched in 1990 as a sports and educational station, but was replaced in 1994. With Radio 5, lived to become a live radio station, following the success of the Radio 4 service to cover the 1991 Gulf War.
The new station would be a news and sports station.
In 1997, BBC News 24, a rolling news channel, launched on digital television services, and the following year, BBC Choice was launched as the third general entertainment channel from the BBC.
The BBC also purchased the parliamentary channel, which was renamed BBC Parliament.
In 1999, BBC Knowledge launched as a multimedia channel with services available on the newly launched BBC Text Digital Teletext service and on BBC Online.
The channel had an educational aim, which was modified later on in its life to offer documentaries. We will continue about BBC in Part 4.